Hi, my name is Esther, pronouns she, her,
And I'm Divy, pronouns she, they.
and this is our podcast, Spirits Rising, where we question everything we've been taught about faith.
Listen to our unfiltered discussions with awesome guests as we explore liberating spiritualities true to our experiences.
Today, we're here with two of our friends from the Ryerson SCM chapter, Eunice and Elliott. Great to have you here, and I invite you to introduce yourselves by telling us your names, pronouns if you like, something that brought you joy today, and how you got involved with SCM.
Um, Hi everyone. My name is Elliot. My pronouns are he, him. Something that brought joy today for me was work. Work has been going really well, and I have a new piece that I wrote that will be coming up on our company's website. So I guess a bit of how I came to join SCM. It was in a pretty roundabout and accidental way. I knew one of the supporting chaplains, Ralph Carl, from my undergrad at U of T through a queer and Christian group on campus. That was a really important support for me during some really difficult and formative years in my young adult life. And I've kept in touch with him since. And so last summer, when during the pandemic, I was looking to sink roots in a church community, and he suggested I try SCM Ryerson out. And it felt a bit weird at first because I wasn't from Ryerson or wasn't an alumni, but they've been really cool, and it's been a really awesome young adults Bible study experience. And I'm very glad to have found this community. So I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's my first podcast, and I'm excited to dig into Christianity a bit more.
Hi everyone, I'm Eunice. I use she, her pronouns. And something that brought me joy today, it's one of my friend's birthdays. So just like remembering why you love that friend and why that friend is so awesome, just reflecting on your friendship, that brought me joy today. And how I got into SCM was through Div, of course, because Divy and I, we love to get into like so many conversations, and of course we're both from Christian backgrounds, so they were telling me about SCM and how they got into it, and then I was like, okay, I'll keep an open mind, I'll come to Bible studies, and it turned out to be an awesome decision, and I really appreciate that. And thank you for having me on today to discuss further.
Yay! I'm really excited because I have conversations with y'all literally every week. So to have it on this platform should be really cool. So today we wanted to talk about an experience that most of us share, which, as Eunice kind of briefly mentioned, is an experience growing up in Christianity, but not just any experience, but growing up in a Christianity that is colonized and or Americanized, and how that may affect us as people of color. And I was hoping we could just share a few sentences of what that experience was like growing up, what kind of church background we're each from, so we kind of have like a base idea. And I can start. So I grew up in a Singaporean American church that was mostly full of Filipinos. That's kind of a short cultural idea of what church environment I grew up in. And to avoid another rock, paper, scissors, I'll make Elliot tell us next.
So I grew up in a church in Singapore. The closest denomination for them would be probably evangelical, with very strong influences from the American evangelical movement in the last century. And I also went to a few Christian schools when I was growing up too, with some Methodists in there. So yeah, that was some of my influences growing up in the church.
And Eunice.
Yeah, so my mom is Catholic and my dad is Presbyterian. He's from Ghana and my mom is Filipino. So I grew up Catholic for the most part, and I went to Catholic school, but there would also be those weekends where we'd like go to my dad's church. And I think it was like within the past decade or so that we started regularly going to my dad's church on Sunday, and my mom would do Catholic services on her time. But yeah, I don't really participate as much anymore, but I like what I'm doing with SCM at the moment. But that's my background.
Last but not least, my co-host, my beautiful, amazing co-host, Esther. What's your church cultural background?
Thanks. Yeah, so I grew up in Toronto going to a Presbyterian church, which was kind of like the midpoint compromise between my dad's upbringing in the United Church and my mom's background in a Christian Reformed church that was and still is mostly Dutch Canadians. So yeah, I grew up in this. I'm quite mainline, moderately progressive Presbyterian church, which was multicultural but definitely European dominated. So yeah, there were a lot of interesting dynamics there that I still find myself reflecting on. Yeah, I'm now going to an Anglican church.
I'm kind of curious about, again, like talking about culturally. I don't know why this is my mind goes. I'm just so interested in this. Like when you say it was multicultural, but then mostly, I think I forgot what you said, like Anglo European Canadian, I guess. What does that like look like? Like what would you say is like the percentage breakdown, if you can think of like it at all? I don't know.
I don't know if I could give you numbers. I guess probably like 60 to 70% of the congregation was white. Again, it was like a small congregation, 40 people. But yeah, and the people of color in the congregation were from a variety of different backgrounds.
My church was also super small. I think my church had like 30, 40 people too. Sometimes like less than 30. I find it really interesting, like my connection with Elliot in a way is, although like he grew up in Singapore, I went to a Singaporean American church in Toronto, and that's really interesting. Um, and Elliot, I know like Singapore is kind of multicultural a bit, but like, was there a specific experience in your church in terms of like culture, and what were the type of like people you saw there and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think Christianity in Singapore is mostly dominated by Chinese people, and I'm half Chinese, and you often see like this sort of marriage between like the elites in Singapore, who are mostly Chinese, taking up positions of power in like government, but they're also very much influenced by the evangelical churches that they attend, and it all like comes it leads to sort of like leading to policy that's very conservative in society. So like things like quote unquote family values being enshrined in law, putting the nuclear family above like other forms of family making, and definitely being very suspicious or hostile towards queer individuals. I think because that was such a big part of my identity, the being queer part, that is the part that I wrestle with most in my history with the Singapore church's context. Yeah, and I'm really curious about your experience with the sort of Singaporean influence, but in another country. I had not thought about that secondary layer where, Singaporeans go overseas to plant their version of church.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Like, honestly, I think one of the reasons why a lot of Filipinos flock to, that's kind of a bad word to use there, but they definitely do, as with any ethnic group, like group together when you're in a foreign country because you want a sense of like security in your identity and you want a sense of family and all that stuff. But I think that I was writing a paper on this, so that's where I'm getting some of this information from. But the kind of like very spirit, I don't know, tell me if this is how it was in your church, but like the very spiritualness of it, like spiritual warfare and like phrases like standing on victory ground, and like there's a very real talk about like demons and fighting against them with this, with using the Holy Spirit and stuff like that. Like that is very real world. And I think again, this is just my personal experience, but like my mom came from a background in which like in the Philippines, syncretic religions are very common. So like they'll mix folklore with Catholicism. So they also do the thing where like you use the force of good, which is Jesus, against some maybe like evil folklore spirits. So it's like there's a similar cultural value there. And I think like it was similar enough to people really be able to take that on and go like run with it. Because it felt homey, even though at the same time it was very like not, it wasn't the same thing at all. But yeah, it was similar in that sense. And it's the same thing, like as you said, like they promote the nuclear family. I've grown up hearing things like, the father is like the head of the household, which already is going off a specific premise of like what an idea of that there even is a father, for example. To get even more personal, could be problematic in families like mine where there is no father figure. So when they would say rhetoric like that, it's like, what does that mean for us then? Like, what does that even mean, right? And then I don't know, and seeing how people would mend and put those together were just so interesting to me. So yeah, this is kind of jumping like deep into the topic we're talking about now. But if I could get your opinions on decolonizing Christianity, big term, like what do you think about that term? Do you think about it at all? Is it important? Like when I say that term, decolonizing Christianity, what do you think about?
Ooh, okay, decolonizing Christianity. Well, one thing I've noticed a lot when I'm like introducing my background is that I say that I lead in with the fact that both my parents' countries were colonized. And I think I do that because it's like I want to emphasize that I don't know, I have like this weird relationship with Christianity because yeah, it's like really important to my parents' lives. But as I started like learning more, and like I'm a history buff, so I like started learning more history and just learning about how wild the Catholic Church was. So obviously I couldn't reconcile it for like the longest time. But now I have to admit, I think the concept of decolonizing Christianity is still like pretty fresh to me. Like I'm still easing into it because I've only started like actually discussing Christianity and coming to conversations about it quite recently. So I am thinking about it more, but it still feels a bit like early on. But I think one thing that I'm learning as I do have more of those conversations is, yeah, it's important to decolonize because I know my mom is still like super religious, but also I see how like she doesn't want to question things. So I'm like, Mom, Christianity did this. How do you feel about that? And then like obviously she gives an answer like, oh, I don't know. But I'm like, okay, but this is important. But I also see how conversations like that, it's like, oh, not to like make my mom a representative of all Catholics or all Filipino Catholics, but it helps me understand which areas of Christianity have maybe not been covered in depth aside from just being spiritual and practice, aside from like being discussed. So that helps. But I think it's important to decolonize Christianity because I still do see the value of Christianity and how much my mom loves it and how important it is to communities. And I think we should look back in history and look at how colonizers have used it and reclaim it so that it's like it's better reconciled, I guess. Yeah, that's how I see it.
I think that's very, very good insight. And how you talk about interacting with your mom actually reminds me of how I question things like these. And usually when you have these kind of religious disputes in your own head, they tell you like, if you want wisdom, you can go to your elders to like talk about these things. And I guess in that situation, like your mom is kind of like, ooh, this person has more experience, or they like, I can ask this person. But in churches like in our group, like you can't go and be like, oh, so like what about decolonizing Christianity? Because they don't have the framework for that. And in some ways they're like part of the process of, they're not just, of course, I'm not trying to like villainize anybody, but they've grown up in like a certain type of Christianity and they don't have the tools or the specific exact framework that we have. And they might decolonize Christianity too in their own way and, you know, do agency in their own way, but just not in the same way that we frame it or talk about it. So yeah, that I found really frustrating. So I kind of like relate to you talking about your mom, because I can imagine trying to go look for wisdom from elders in my church, but I wouldn't actually go to them because they wouldn't really have answers for that.
Yeah, I just want to say again, yeah, I feel the exact same way, because obviously my parents are the ones who are telling me to, hey, do this. It's like Lent, do this. But then when I have questions, like, yeah, they're not equipped to answer because they weren't taught to actually look throughout the history and actually think about Christianity and practices like that. And that makes me kind of frustrated too, because I know sometimes in church they tell the parents it's up to the parents to like bring up your children as Christians and make sure they're Christians. So sometimes I feel bad because it's like, man, I went to my parents for answers, but they couldn't give me answers, and then in turn that made me distrustful. And then I feel bad because then I don't know how my parents feel about that, especially my mom, when like her priest is saying it's up to the parents to upbring your children as Christians and ensure they go to heaven, or else you didn't do your job. Like, that's so horrible to think about. I hate thinking about that.
I agree. And I think that also has to do with like the hierarchical relationship in church of like, and the patriarchal relationship is like, oh, again, using the father as the head, but like this person like knows things and they need to have the approval for things and this and that. But I think in reality, it's more like your parents probably learn more, in most cases, I hope, from the previous generation, and your parents give you a certain set of skills and everything they know, and then you're supposed to take that and like do more with it rather than have your cap be like your parents' knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could share a thought, yeah, that's something that Eunice was, well, both of you were kind of getting at something that really that I keep seeing, and that actually, yeah, makes me kind of sad, is the way that, I'm colonization, I'm like evangelization, like quite strategically tries to interrupt the transmission of culture. That it's all about trying to replace I'm a local culture with this kind of Americanized culture, American religion, and that makes it really tricky to, honor your elders and acknowledge how that history has affected them. That's something that I also struggle with in the different sense of, understanding that my church, my family come from this colonizing tradition, and how do I find what's, good and true within that tradition despite all of the baggage, because I don't want to just disown it altogether. So often that's how white people end up appropriating other people's cultural and spiritual traditions. So yeah, that I appreciate that we're, process.
Oh my gosh, but can I just say, when you said that's how white people end up appropriating other people, To be honest, I have never ever framed it that way. I've never looked at it that way. All I know is I see appropriation and I see this and that. But like I've never connected those two of like, oh, they deny their own culture in order to get rid of all the negatives that have been done in the past instead of taking responsibility for it and like shaping their own traditional cultures. And then they appropriate other people's cultures and spiritualities because they think it's like a more pure form of, they're trying to get away from all the baggage, all the negative. But when it really like it's you gotta do the work. And then what's also crazy that I'm just thinking about right now, people of color then and women are the ones leading like decolonization and coming in trying to clean up the mess for the people who, anyways, I'm starting to ramble now, but that was so well put, Esther. I really I'm happy you shared that. That was really good.
These things.
I just want to add on to what's been, I guess, been discussed. I really resonate when you talked about, I guess, having to process a lot of the norms you grew up with, especially for us who I assume that all of us kind of grew up in the church, like we weren't new converts. I didn't really think about decolonization until probably the last few years when it became, I guess, more a part of our vocabulary, I think for me, I've done a lot of reflecting on, I guess, what I don't want my Christianity to be, and that's how I kind of just so-called justify staying in the church despite all these like horrible things that have come up. And it's important, I think, for all of us to think about how we can not reproduce a lot of these norms, things that we go after our elders for. Like it's very easy for us to kind of do it accidentally as well. For me, the biggest one is the impulse to like evangelize in a very overbearing and disrespectful way. I think like for a while, I was really worried that I wasn't being Christian enough because I just didn't want to do the street evangelism that I grew up with, like just harassing. There's no better way of like word of using, like harassing like people on the street to follow Jesus. And learning that there are more faithful representations of and examples in history of what like okay evangelizing looks like. And I think like the most obvious one is kind of like living your own life and like holding high standards of yourself first before like going out, and then by virtue of you like embodying like Christian virtues and ideals, you are sort of evangelizing, right? Like what you believe in. And just like maybe cutting out all the missionary stuff like that, the white supremacy, but not just white supremacy. Like in Singapore, I'm embarrassed to say that my preteen years, I had to go on this mission trip with my church, literally just to paint orphanages. And so you have like this dynamic between like a very rich Singaporean people going out to poorer Southeast Asian countries, and again reproducing the same norms that like was passed down through the Americans, through the British missionaries and the colonizers, and stuff like that.
So much good stuff there. Like I remember when I first started being awakened to how bad missionary work is now. Like we have this thing called like a mission faith pledge in the church I grew up to. So you're paying to send missionaries from the home church in Singapore to other countries. For example, our pastor was a missionary technically, right? Because he's not from Toronto, he's from Singapore. So we were paid, like you would make a faith pledge and everyone would stand up in church with the pledge and you were like, my faith pledge, and you'd read it and you wouldn't say out loud what amount you'd pledge, but you'd like obviously mentally like they tell you to pray over it, how much do you feel like God is telling you to give and all that stuff. And honestly, again, with what Esther said, taking the good with the bad, I think there is good in the sense of like they give you space to meditate and pray on what you want to give up. And although you're not necessarily giving to something that may be like a good thing to give, like you're producing like a giving heart and that kind of thing. But when I realized how like messed up it was, and when I tell you I was giving, okay, to out myself, to be honest, I was giving like hundreds of dollars in my teenage years when I was going to high school. I would work so much in high school. Right after school, I'd run to work. I'm working so hard. And a lot of that money would go to missions because I was so religious and so whatever. honestly, thank God though, because it never made me super broke, which of course I'm a student, so I don't have to pay rent, so that's nice. But like, and then the 1 year I realized like, yo, this is wrong. Like I felt conviction, like I felt guilt to even give any drop of money to that, because I was like, whatever money I give to this, it's gonna go to exactly what Elliott said, right? That like savior complex of people going out and doing missions. So I was like, you know what, this like starting now, I'm not giving anymore. And then of course the leaders, they see like who's giving whatever, so they thought I was starting to backslide, because I went from giving like hundreds of dollars, like most of my money, to like all of a sudden nothing from me. So they thought like, oh, this is like not good. They called me Marianne's starting to backslide, all this stuff. But it's like, no, I feel like my eyes have just been opened, that like, how could I have been contributing this? And Elliott's saying, I wanted to go on a mission trip so bad. They make it look so nice on the commercials, like go travel, this and that. And oh man, so bad.
Wow. I remember as a teenager doing like youth group fundraising projects, but that was just like, you know, coming up with nice strategies to ask the adults in the congregation for money. We were definitely not expected to give our own monies. Yeah, that really makes an impression. Yeah. No, I guess I find it super interesting hearing out of the different ways that we've experienced this tradition of, or this idea of mission and what that looks like, what that means. Because in my church growing up, mission was actually almost completely conflated with aid and development work. Like evangelization wasn't usually even on the agenda. It was all about, you know, we are Christians, therefore we love people and we give to the poor and etc. And so yeah, it's interesting that for me it's been a different journey, not so much of like untangling the theologies of evangelizing, but I'm untangling kind of the Western mode of aid and development and how that's problematic and colonial in its own way.
It's really interesting hearing the environments, I don't know if that's the right word, but the communities you both were in, about how much they pushed it to the point where it was like, oh my gosh, like this trip, yeah, I totally want to go to that. Like all my friends are going, like totally. Or of course, like Elliott, if you're sort of like, oh, I don't know about this, but you still go. But yeah, I'm like reflecting on my experience. My church didn't, I guess I'm thinking of the Catholic one, it didn't really like push any missionary work, or there weren't, or maybe I didn't remember, but there weren't any like, ooh, sign up for like this trip, or ooh, your children, you should be thinking about like, here's a like a missionary trip and do that, like to do that stuff. So yeah, it's really interesting hearing your guys' perspective about that and how much it influenced your thoughts. And then it's making me wonder, maybe since my church community didn't push that much, and I've said this before, but that environment also didn't feel too warm and welcoming. So I guess I always felt really distant. So I'm wondering if like that also impacted why I'm not so close to church and like really into church activities and stuff like that. So, but really interesting insight.
It's interesting. I'm having so many like memories pop up around missions too. Because Esther, I think even though your church was focus, I mean, I don't know the socioeconomic status of the people in your church, but they're focusing on aid through giving, and I think this might be a really wrong analysis, but when you come from a church where maybe most people come from like lower class, you don't really have much to give except for your time and your words. So I think your version of evangelizing becomes I can't really offer aid because I'm the one in need of aid, but I do have the word of God. Like the spirit of church is so different. It becomes like such a survival safety line thing, and by virtue of that, a very passionate thing. Like I sincerely believe a lot of people in my church who would do that, they do it because they sincerely believe like this is something that has really like saved me a lot of times, and like this is good news, and everyone needs to do exactly what I'm doing to receive this good news as well. Which again, it's problematic because see how like you're, even though you're in a different status, you're inheriting the colonial mindset in a way. It might be a bit harsh to put it that way, but that's just how I feel about it.
No, that's fair. I've had a lot of conversations with people about, how do you even respond to this question that so many mostly older white people in the mainline churches have about why the young people and why people of color don't want to come to their churches. And it's very much, I think a big part of it is that of culture, that so much of what's taught about generosity, about kind of who we are as Christians in the world comes from that sort of the assumption of privilege and having resources to help people. And something that I really appreciate in what I hear about the experiences of people who grew up in immigrant churches, or other churches that are primarily people of color, is that that experience of mutual aid, even if there also is all that stuff about evangelizing, to unlearn.
You kind of bring up an interesting point that I'm interested to hear like Elliott and Eunice's perspective on, which is the idea of like why don't especially young people of color want to continue going to church. Like, to share my experience, this is just like what I observed, but it's the overly critical voice of people who are supposed to be your religious leaders. So then they're kind of like painting an image of God as a critical thing. I heard people describe it as homework, and just like they don't let you be part of society. Like that's how. So I think it also depends on maybe how strict the church is, because like I remember I used to like, my guilty pleasure was watching Vampire Diaries, but I'd have to do it in secret because that was one of the things where it's like there's vampires in it, so you can't watch like things like that. And right now my hair is blue. I have fake tattoos, some of them real, some of them fake. And again, that's something is like even like henna or like drawing on your like things marking about, like they were so harsh, so critical of everything because there's a very narrow box of things you can do for it to be godly, and then everything outside of that is super detrimental. So from my personal church experience is that people didn't want to live that way. People don't want to live in a religious, like hard, strict, critical way. Like it's not freedom. Like that doesn't really feel free. So that's, to my observations, why the people I know didn't return. But I'm curious to hear other people's opinions and like why you stayed.
I feel like, and I'm saying this as someone who's like entering like my later 20s. I've spent some time like wrestling with why am I in the church. I think it's really tough for young people to separate the moral hypocrisy that they see in the leaders from the theology, and it's difficult not to like, I guess, conflate the two things, and maybe, I guess, extend some compassion towards these. Because I want to be careful here. I'm not justifying, I guess, the hypocrisy, but to seeing that they're very human, and I guess sin very much permeates like the church. It is a human institution, and it can, I guess, serve as a pretty big barrier to people wanting to explore more or even experiment with better versions of Christianity. And those definitely exist, but you might have to like expend some effort to find. And a good example is like SCM. Like I would never have found SCM on my own. I wouldn't even know what to Google, right? Like, what do you even like what keywords? I guess some keywords could work, but then I don't know. How do you know if they're legit? There are a lot of like so-called progressive churches that lack a lot of theological substance, and you don't want to go that way either. Yeah, so I guess it might be like a time of searching for a lot of young people, and this might be like a universal experience where maybe young people who grew up in the church kind of have to leave it in order to find their way back and come back with like a renewed sense. And then to feel like they really own it too, right? Because it's not your parents' religion. It's not something like you grew up in. It's like you choose to believe it, and therefore now you have a responsibility to do right by your beliefs. Yeah, I think that's what I'm thinking, but I'm curious to know, I guess, what Eunice is thinking, since you're closer to Gen Z.
Well, okay, so I think in my opinion, me personally, the reason why one thing that you said, Elliot, really resonated was that your teenage years are a time where you're really like trying to find yourself and trying to like figure out who you are. And I think obviously I think the biggest thing is when it feels like you're being forced to do stuff. And obviously in the church, well, in the Catholic Church, you have to fulfill sacraments. And I remember the one thing that made me so irritated was when I had to take classes for confirmation. And like with confirmation, that's also a time where I was being so critical of religion. I was like, man, like y'all really want to follow this? Like, do you even know the truth? So I was going through like one of those like, oh my gosh, I'm enlightened. You guys are still like, so I was going through that at the time too. And I think, yeah, it's what someone said earlier, it felt like a chore, but also the person who was running the confirmation classes, no offense, but he was so, okay, I don't want to speak like rudely about anyone, but he was really trying to push that stereotypical Christian like idea where it's like, if you don't do this, you're gonna go to hell. You need to follow the, like you need to do it. And then he would like show pictures of hell in like flames and stuff to try to convince us to, you know, once you get confirmed, you gotta be a good Christian. And then I'm sitting in these confirmation classes and I'm like, what the heck? First of all, a lot of those images were from like literature, not necessarily the Bible. So a lot of what like you're thinking about what hell is influenced by stuff like Dante and like other like Christian writers. And you don't know that because you don't want to look into that. You're only like told, ooh, so this is hell. This is a great like scary thing I can show my kids. Okay, well, okay, I'm going off. But anyway, but yeah, essentially, I think young people don't necessarily like going to church because it feels like you're forced to do stuff. You're forced to wake up at 9 a.m. I never had breakfast when I went to church. I was always mad about that. I'm always like, man, I'm hungry. I want to sleep in. And then, yeah, this feels like a chore. My mom, sorry, Mom, I love you, but you forced me to get confirmed when I was having doubts. I remember I was saying, Mom, I don't feel comfortable about this. I'm having doubts about it. I'm not sure. And she was like, no, you need to do it. And I was like, okay. So that was another, but that's why I think young people don't necessarily like the church because, yeah, it's old values. It feels like you're being forced into things and the community doesn't feel supportive. But another thing I wanted to say in regards to race and in regards to like immigrant populated churches, I was thinking about this one incident that really made a huge impression on me. And it's when like over 10 years ago, my sister from Ghana, she won a green card and she was coming over to America. So then we set her up in Buffalo. So we were trying to get things like prepared for her. So we'd be going to Buffalo often. And of course, we usually go on the weekends. And since church is important to my parents, they wanted to find a Presbyterian church to just like go to church, be in that environment for Sunday morning. And totally understandable. But I remember we found one church and then we went inside and everyone was already in the service. And I remember we reached the place where people enter to the main area. And then we noticed that everybody was white. And then the people who came out to like, hello. And like, they were white too. And then I forgot exactly what was said, but essentially we ended up leaving. And then my dad was like, I'm not gonna go in a church where it's all white people. And I was like, whoa. And I was like, but obviously reflecting on it now, I sort of understand why, in a sense, he wouldn't want to be in a church with all white people, because he doesn't see images of himself. Also, my dad, he's very critical about race issues and just like how white people have treated Black people, of course. So, but I don't know, that experience really left an impact on me, because it's like my dad literally refused to worship with white people. I know his reasons, but but I do understand. I think what Esther said before about a community like that not having the proper like tools and the proper resources to like, I guess, interact with a person of color, because essentially, as much as we love to say, oh, I don't see, well, not all of us love to say that, but as much as we want to say like, oh, I don't see color, we can worship together, there are cultural aspects and racial aspects that a lot of people do take into account when they want to subscribe to a church community. So yeah, I was thinking about that as y'all were talking and making really good points.
In some ways, that's kind of leading into the next question I wanted to ask, which is exploring, that whole interrelation of spirituality and culture. As I wanted to ask all of you, what does decolonizing Christianity look like in your own spiritual life, and what practices, what sources do you find life-giving?
Like I said earlier, I'm still kind of new to actually decolonizing. So right now I'm at the conversation phase where I'm talking about it with other people, especially other people my age who come from immigrant backgrounds and stuff like that. But also what really helped me was my program, Arts and Contemporary Studies, and they really equipped me with the tools to like look back in history and really be critical of it. So I really appreciate that. And I feel if I were to go deeper into my quest to decolonize Christianity, I know how to search it up. I think I'd start by like, of course, reading articles about people who have actually written about decolonizing Christianity and like, this is what colonization did in Christianity and this is how it's transforming and what it could be. But yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now.
I think for me, I try to be more open to other ways of knowing. I would say that this is probably like my foundational guiding principle in my faith. And I've had like conversations with people in my life where it ended up in like people were, I guess, pretty upset and felt that my views were heretical just because of how much I downgraded like the evangelical viewpoint as like the way to know Christianity. And so like me saying that, evangelicals and that whole like denomination I grew up with, they're not necessarily ones with capital T truth. It sounds, I think, a bit heretical to like a lot of those people are still in my life today because of like family and close friends. I'm not saying that like I think all belief systems are equal, but I do think that there's so much that we can learn from other belief systems. And part of decolonization, as I understand it, is like tracing the roots of your beliefs and how political it was. It's not like made in a vacuum. It's not neutral. There's like power dynamics. You want to decenter. I'm forgetting my terminology. I've been out of school a few years, but I think you get what I'm trying to say. I guess just trying to be like more humble, right? Like being curious too about the Bible and what a verse could mean versus like, I think this is how it's written and I'm going to take it extremely literally, but I'm also going to pick and choose, which is a lot of Christianity. Being very confident.
No, I definitely echo the piece about reinterpreting the Bible in social historical context, under and trying to see what we can do to kind of strip away some of the like colonial theologies that have been overlaid on the Bible.
Their assertions.
Yeah, the tracing the roots as well. I'm curious about kind of what all of your experiences have been with kind of exploring like specific, like culturally specific Christian traditions. So I know something that's been really helpful for me is, getting into the medieval mystics and like early Celtic Christianity and stuff, and learning some of these spiritual traditions that originated before white people invented colonialism.
A lot of what Elliott said really resonated. I think when you were talking about specifically people thinking your beliefs were like heretical, and like capital T truth versus like little t truth, and that people's beliefs aren't neutral, they're embedded with like power and all these things. I remember several moments of people looking at me and being like, you don't know the truth, because I would say things that were going against their version of what a perfect Christianity is, what the Bible says, when how they're reading the Bible isn't, one, is not the only way to read the Bible, two, is not historically necessarily accurate because they don't have all the information, but they're reading it the way they've been trained to read it in this Americanized, colonized way. And if I try to assert, I don't think this is what that's saying, I think it's saying this, immediately shut down, like, you're wrong. And I Esther, that's really interesting of looking into what you said about looking into Christianity before colonization was a thing, because I've like for the Philippines, for example, like there is no Christianity pre-colonization, because of course, like the first time Christianity was in the Philippines was through colonization, through the Spanish. So whenever I start looking at traditional folklore, and I think the word is animism and things like that, that really does, I don't know, there's like a spiritual, cultural like spark in you that's like, oh my gosh, this is like my history. It's like a reconnection. It's like, this is gonna sound so weird, maybe overly mystical, but it's like a love at first sight feeling. Like sometimes when you're like on a first date and you like guys click, it's like that same like feeling, like it feels really good. And then on my other side, my dad's side, I don't know much about that culturally. I know it's like Scottish, Irish, something. So to look into that stuff would be kind of interesting. And I think it would be a different experience because I don't have the same connection to my paternal side as I do my maternal side. But I'm also curious, like if you with Eunice and Elliott have experience like looking into pre-colonial either versions of Christianity or other religious or spiritual aspects of your cultures.
Sorry, I feel like I should jump in to say that pre-colonial, I actually should correct what I said there, because even the people of Northwestern Europe became Christians because of Roman colonization. But I'm talking about the religious practices, the spiritualities of a time before the the people in Northwestern Europe, the British Isles, before they became colonizers. But yes, would love to hear more from all of you.
Me personally, and I feel like a little bad for it, but I've spent like the past few years looking at other cultures, and I'd always become so fascinated by other cultures. But to be honest, I haven't looked much into like Filipino history and Ghanaian history, which again, I feel a bit bad about, because like, why wouldn't I look at my own roots? Why am I so invested in other people's cultures and stuff like that? But I guess now that we're discussing decolonization, okay, I guess one thought that came to mind was that it's a bit intimidating, to be honest, because that is such a huge body of information. And actually, no, I think I do know why I've been looking at other cultures, because obviously in the school system, you're only learning about European history, like Asian history, African history is like a blip and maybe not even in the curriculum at all. So I'd always be equipped with like, oh, I remember this aspect of European history. So I'll just like keep looking further into that. But yeah, I don't know. I think I'd have to say, to be honest, I'm a bit intimidated about how much history there is to look. And also, I guess I'm sort of apprehensive because there's also, I think this is my ignorant belief, but like the way history is recorded, I guess too, because it's like, if you go through 223andMe and stuff like that, it's like, people often say, oh, it's so much easier for white people because white people like documented everything. And it's so much harder for people of color because like, first of all, colonizers probably destroyed their birth records or like records that they kept to like completely erase that part of history. So, but that's a belief I'm holding that I need to strike down and be like, I should at least try. I shouldn't just believe that. But yeah, I only know like very vaguely how my parents' countries were colonized and about my own personal connection to those regions. So I'm not 100%, I don't have a clear picture on like where to look and how deep I should go and what resources I'd have to actually do that. So I'm gonna say I'm intimidated at this point, but I'm still open. But yeah.
I would say I feel very similarly to Eunice here. I think Esther has identified a gap in my knowledge, and also, to be honest, I guess in my interest. It's more exciting to like, I guess, look to the future or the now and like build new things with like the coolest stuff that we've just read, versus to like go back and like wrestle with all those like thorny questions and messy histories. So yeah, so thank you for that question. I'm gonna look into it.
I think those are good. Oh, sorry, Esther.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, I just want to acknowledge that yes, doing that kind of work is definitely harder for people of color because of the exact issues that Eunice
I
named.
was gonna say, like, those are definitely valid thoughts, and at the same time, I don't know, it is easy to feel guilty of like I don't know, I try not to feel guilty for it, of like not being able to reclaim certain things because it feels like an obligation to do it, but I definitely think we shouldn't feel guilty for it. Like, I'm not trying to impose, this is just my like take on it. But like because I remember actually my white father telling me when I was trying to tell him about me learning about the Jewish population in, I think it was Ethiopia or something like that, that I was learning in school. I'm like, this is so cool, this and that. And then he was like, why don't you learn about your own history? Like, why are you looking into all these other things? And I'm like, at the moment, I was like, okay, harsh. But then it's like, we kind of do that to ourselves too. Like, as people of color, like you feel guilty for like going into looking into other traditions when you don't know anything about your own. But like, it's important to remember that it's not our fault that that's the case. And it is like a lot of hard work, and you're not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy for you to do it right off the bat. And actually, you researching other cultures might help you learn strategies into researching your own. And the reason why I maybe was researching Jewish cultures in Ethiopia at the time was because there's no history of the Philippines course at the university I go to. So that's just the journey I was on and the journey I was going on. So yeah, not to be like overly critical of ourselves and how much we know and just where we are, you know what I mean? So I just wanted to mention that.
Wow, I'd like to say I really appreciate you saying that, Div. Because yeah, it's true. It's like, oh man, why aren't I learning my own culture? But also, like the way I grew up, even though like to be honest, I barely know anything about my dad's side, and I'm not like culturally connected through family, through friends, anything like that. So that also makes it tough where it's like, man, you don't know anything about like your African side, and then like the whole cultural thing of like, oh man, you're acting white and stuff like that. And it like opens the door to so many things. But yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and I'm going to think about it as I like move on with my journey and be like, I should pay more attention, but in ways that like I can do at my pace that I feel comfortable with.
stop myself from rambling because I do have another question I want to ask y'all. But like, even that topic of whiteness and like, oh, you're acting white. Like, for me too, like being half white, I notice people, they'll use it depending on what suits them in the moment. So they're either call out my Pinoy-ness, my Filipino-ness, if it's convenient for the joke at hand or whatever they're talking about, or they'll call out my white side and be like, you're acting white, depending on what the situation is. And you can feel very like it's out of your control. Everyone's commenting on your race and on your identity for their own benefit and how they perceive you, rather than you being able to call out like and assert for yourself like, what it is. We kind of covered a bit. I know Elliott mentioned ideas of like how a family structure should look. And I think you mention queerness a little bit, like how certain churches are against that. But we, in our newfound faith or in how we see religious now, we're queer affirming. SCM is queer affirming and Christian. So either expanding on those two things or adding on to them, how do you think you see Christianity differently than your experience growing up?
I think for me, Christianity feels a lot less stressful in one really big way. I'm much less concerned with being right. During my late teens, I think even through like maybe second year university, I was really invested in Christian apologetics. Like I read all the books. I watched all the YouTube videos with debates between apologists like William Lane Craig, going after the new atheists or other religions, and like just like memorizing all these arguments and like trying to be like, oh, is it like soundproof? Going to like the Ravi Zacharias like meetings on campus, like, oh yeah, it's super problematic now. Looking back, there were a lot of red flags. Yeah, so like being like just I guess being really concerned that if I didn't have an airtight answer to like Christianity, then I didn't have a basis for believing in it, and that I would have to be an atheist. And then I don't know what happened, but like it was kind of like overnight, I just lost interest in all that. And I just knew in my heart, it was getting a little sappy, that Christianity isn't for me. And my priorities going forward are how I can, I guess, work as a person to exemplify those values that I admire, and taking, I guess, like a book like James really seriously. If you don't know, for anyone who's listening doesn't know, because I haven't read all the books of the Bible. I've only read James like 3 times. James like really goes after the church for needing to provide for the poor and the marginalized. And there's this like huge ethical demand on us. And so that is where I'm at in my Christianity today, which is like a different kind of stress, but I feel like a much more productive stress and in the right direction, right? Not like wasting time debating all these like esoteric and frankly kind of pointless topics. It's about what you do in life.
If I can just comment on that. I also feel like that Christianity of like it has to be logically sound correct. That is also like the colonizers' Christianity, because like they come in declaring Christianity and imposing on others based on the idea that this is the right only thing and it is right because XYZ, and demonizing everything else. So like I've been there before. I used to watch those videos too and like get so emotional and passionate over like the debates. And now I'm at a place where like if people are like religious debate, I'm like, how do you even debate over a religion? Like that's not really the nature of like spirituality, and what religion is supposed to be is like sound correctness. Like if you're going that direction, in my personal opinion, you're like kind of missing the point, I guess.
I think in my experience, like what I said before was mostly just, it's not that my mom would force me, but she'd be like, oh, we're going to church. And then I'd be like, and then she'd be like, what'd you say? And it'd be sort of like a guilt thing. So I just go. But I think what I'm really, really grateful for and what I really appreciate from my parents was that at some point they just stopped like doing that. Like they stopped being like, okay, let's go to church. Like we're gonna go to church. So they stopped like pushing that on me. And I feel like yeah, within the last decade or so, I did have the space to like branch out and like learn more and sort of make my own thoughts. And then now, of course, like I said, I'm sort of being more open to revisiting Christianity, and it's helped actually so much because, again, I'm not being forced into it. And no worries, Elliott, to be completely honest, I have not read the Bible in full at all. Obviously, I'd like hear stories as I was growing up and maybe like we read little bits of the Bible, but like I like literally every time we go into Bible study, whenever someone's like, oh, let's do this story. I remember I grew up with it and stuff like that. I'm like, I don't know this story. Like maybe I vaguely know it, but I don't like, I wouldn't even know what verse to look up. So sometimes I'm like, what verse is it? But that's something I also I really appreciate, and at this stage in my life where maybe there is something beneficial about me not having read the Bible in full as a kid, or maybe not having it pounded into me. So then I didn't have like, like a certain story, it's pounded into me and I think of it a certain way because that was based on the way it was taught to me. But now that I'm revisiting Christianity and I'm doing SCM Bible studies and I'm coming in with my own mind and my own thoughts and with the openness to learn more, I feel like I really love that I was afforded the place to do that, to look at the Bible almost with a set of fresh new eyes and hear so many different perspectives from my peers, and trying to move on with Christianity in a way where I can reconcile with it and that I can feel comfortable with it and grow with it, as opposed to like as a kid where everyone's telling you to, okay, this is Christianity, this is what we do, this is how we're gonna do it. It's like, no, I'm an adult now, my parents don't nag me no more, and I can move forward on my terms. So yeah.
I really like that on my terms part. If I were to try to summarize really briefly how my Christianity now is different from my Christianity when I was growing up, it would be that I let go of the desire for certainty. That, you know, like Elliott was saying, for a while I was really interested, you know, absorbed in apologetics and, you know, how do I know that there's a God? How can I call myself a Christian if I'm not absolutely certain that God is real and that I know what God is like? And now not knowing is fine. And I expect that I am going to keep on, that my beliefs and my spirituality are going to keep on changing for the rest of my life based on what I learned from other people. And that's awesome. Thank you so much for this. Any last thoughts, last questions before we wrap?
I just want to say that I really enjoyed this podcast episode because it's just like how I enjoy Bible studies. It's like we could. I just want to say that I really enjoyed this podcast episode because it's just like how I enjoy Bible studies. It's like we get to just like have fun, chill, talk, be open about our thoughts, and these aren't conversations you'd have on the everyday. So it's good to like set aside the time and be like, let's think about this. I just really appreciate that y'all said yes to doing the podcast and being so open with your thoughts. It was really good. I liked it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Esther and Divy, for providing the space and inviting me to talk about things. Because, yeah, admittedly, I do think deeper about things when I actually say it out loud. And I'm like, oh, did I say that? Oh, I should unpack that. But I really appreciate spaces and conversations like this. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you both as well. Very similar to how the SCM Bible studies go, we often find ourselves in like really interesting big picture questions that get glossed over, I guess, in like the day-to-day business of being a person or a Christian. And I look forward to following you on this podcast journey.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Spirits Rising. You can watch us on YouTube or listen to us at anchor.fm, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Our thanks to the Student Christian Movement for supporting this project, and especially to the SCM York Chapter's partnership with St. Theodore of Canterbury Anglican Church and the Diocese of Toronto's REACH grant.